Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to what promises to be a very interesting discussion. My name is Gennady Stolyarov II, and with me today I have a fount of information, knowledge, and insight, Franco Cortese, who is one of the up-and-coming thinkers of the transhumanist movement. He is an affiliate scholar of the Institute for Ethics and Emerging Technologies, a research scientist at the ELPIS Foundation for Indefinite Lifespans, assistant editor of RIA University Press, fellow of the Brighter Brains Institute, ambassador for the Seasteading Institute, and chief operating officer for the Center for Interdisciplinary Philosophic Studies. So definitely an individual of wide-ranging pursuits and wide-ranging interests. Welcome, Franco. So,
thanks, Gennady. It's wonderful to be here.
Indeed, indeed, and hopefully we will have a similarly wide-ranging discussion. I'd like to begin by asking you a question that motivated one of my earlier discussions with Damian Zivkovic, and that question is, what do you consider to be humankind's best opportunities for achieving a bright future within the next several decades?
I would say in general emerging technologies and using emerging technologies to increase our degree of self-determination. I think that human history and the long history that humankind has had with technology is a story about increasing self-determination, using technology to increase our own ability to determine the conditions and circumstances of our own being as well as the world around us. So in general, using emerging technologies to increase our degree of self-determination, and in particular, I would say that nano-bio-info-cogno technologies, NBIC, are the best mode to increase our degree of self-determination.
Very good answer. I think you very succinctly summarized essentially the key force that can make our lives better during the next several decades, the emerging technologies. You touched on the various strains of those. Now, on the flip side of this issue, what do you consider to be the greatest obstacles to the realization of such a bright future? What developments or what threats do you think might prevent those emerging technologies from coming to be and from benefiting humans in the way we hope that they would?
Well, I would say that the misuse and misapplication of emerging technologies holds just as much peril as it does promise for us. In particular, the ethical and safety ramifications of artificial intelligence, and in particular, recursively self-improving artificial intelligence. I think that that's a great security concern.
So this is, I think, an interesting topic to branch into a bit, because you had a recent paper where you discussed the concept of a maximally distributed intelligence explosion as a way of countering that problem, making sure that accelerating intelligence benefits everybody and doesn't create asymmetrical advantages for any entity. So could you go into a bit more depth into that concept?
Yeah, that was the subject of a talk I gave at the 2014 Spring Symposia at Stanford University. The intelligence explosion in general is a concept introduced by J. Good in the 1960s. And basically it starts with an artificial intelligence that is powerful enough to self-modify itself. And once it's able to self-modify itself, it creates a situation where every time it self-modifies itself, its ability to self-modify in future iterations becomes easier, and it sort of creates a snowball effect, essentially ramping that intelligence up into superintelligence, far beyond what we can comprehend. And the concept of a maximally distributed intelligence explosion um, basically argues that one of the best ways to prevent that gap is to have a tiered system in which we only let those recursively self-improving AIs increase their intelligence to a point where they're slightly above the slightly above the average intelligence of humans, and disallowing them uh, self-modifying themselves until self-modification in humans, to the end of always keeping a relative par between the available intelligence of humans and AI.
Now, it's an interesting concept to have the intelligence of human beings improve essentially to keep pace with improvements in artificial intelligence. And certainly that would benefit human beings greatly to undergo those improvements through modifications of our bodies, perhaps augmentations to our bodies that integrate electronic components with biological components, assuming that therapies will develop to do so safely, to do so effectively without side effects that medical treatments will sometimes have today. So my question is, with regard to how the trajectory of standalone AI, for lack of a better term, is expected to advance versus how the augmentation technologies that are available to human beings are expected to advance. Do you think there would be any need for artificially restricting the development of standalone AIs, or would this maximally distributed intelligence explosion essentially occur as the outcome of a less constrained dynamic, just because it so happens that the progress of human augmentation technologies will be sufficiently rapid that then if humans go ahead and develop some super intelligent standalone systems as well, that won't be too much of a concern because there will still be a rough parity?
Right. Well, that's definitely a concern. The trajectory for those technologies that will allow us to self-modify ourselves certainly require more development than the infrastructure required for self-modifying AI. Largely because they're software, so any changes that they need to make can be done electronically almost directly, whereas with humans we need to develop physical systems to actually augment our physical hardware, our brains. But because the minds of those AI are software, they could modify it directly. So I don't think that the timeline for the development of AI self-modification and human self-modification are on par. I think that if there's any way to accelerate the development of those technologies required to physically augment ourselves, then those avenues should be explored, because as it currently stands, it should be much easier for AI, once they reach a level where they have the capacity to self-modify themselves, it'll be much easier for them, and that raises some security and ethical concerns.
So I've sometimes been thinking about what if there came to be a super intelligent general AI, what that would look like. Would it be more along the lines of a super powerful being that can control a lot of resources and essentially change the world so rapidly that humans wouldn't be able to respond, which is the fear of some people in the transhumanist community? Or on the other hand, and this is a thought I've also entertained, would it be such a dependent system on all of the infrastructure that came before, say, on just the fact that it has to be instantiated in some sort of electronic device that humans built and have custody over, that it would essentially be like a savant with no immune system who's stuck in essentially a room that has been cleansed of all bacteria and viruses, but if he steps out of that room, he will die, irrespective of all of his mental brilliance. So this is one question that I have for you. Do you think that latter possibility is more likely than the former possibility? And if so, would that mitigate some of the concerns about creating a superintelligent AI, just because for the first few years or decades or however long it takes, at least, it'll be on life support from humans and dependent on what humans give it?
Right. I would put my chips with the former rather than the latter. I think that those safeguards in place such that it is dependent deliberately on hardware safeguards that we put in place. If we don't deliberatively do that, then I think it's quite likely that it can find out ways to bypass those concerns.
And then I suppose another question is from a moral angle. Let's say there is such a super intelligent being. Let's say it has independent thought, volition. If it were instantiated in some sort of body, it would behave in a goal-driven, autonomous manner. If it is constrained in some way from without, let's say the constraints are beyond those that are just necessary in the course of its development. But if besides that, humans start saying, well, you can't venture into those areas, you can't think those particular thoughts, you can't undertake those particular actions, could there be a backlash from that? Could it perceive its ethical autonomy to be limited and therefore start despising humans, whereas a more permissive approach, admitting that entity as a rights-bearing entity with similar prerogatives as humans, could actually lead to a better outcome in terms of cooperation, coexistence, mutual respect?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting position, and I would say that there's a large possibility that that's correct. It's a double-edged sword. If we try and restrict its autonomy, yes, it might despise us, but if we don't, then it's not as it's more volatile. So I would say that it could go either way. Although I certainly don't think that intelligence correlates with morality in any sense. I mean, we're very intelligent beings as humans, but we still, swat mosquitoes, and mosquitoes are really incredible things. I mean, they're marvels. They have little brains, and they're incredibly complex and full things, but we still swat them like pests. And if an AI were as much more intelligent with regards to us as we are to mosquitoes, then I mean we probably consider ourselves the most moral beings around, but we still swat mosquitoes, and so I don't think that intelligence and morality are necessarily correlative.
Well, it's an interesting question to think about. Does superior intelligence lead, or at least tend to lead, to superior morality? We could think of people, of course, who are relatively intelligent but still evil. On the other hand, there is the Steven Pinker thesis articulated in his book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, exploring the causes of why violence has statistically declined, especially in more advanced societies, and part of that is due to economic freedom, greater prosperity, meaning we have more to lose if we initiate violence against other people, but also human intelligence has increased. IQ tests actually have to be renormalized every decade or so, because if a person were to follow the same scale as had been used several decades ago, then most people's IQs today would be in the 120s, 130s. So there has been improvement in human intelligence, and there has been a corresponding decline in violence and other forms of vice. Now, not everywhere, and there are sporadic flare-ups of violence. We can name a lot of examples where it seems to be a dynamic of 2 steps forward, 1 step back, and if you're living through that 1 step back stage, things don't look particularly good. But it still seems to me that if you have a greater preponderance of intelligence, there is at least a tendency for more moral decisions to be made. And of course, some exceptions are possible for that. But if we take that general premise and we consider, well, how might it relate to AI, wouldn't it also be the case that a human being left to his or her own devices could wreak some mischief? I mean, people do commit crimes, people do infringe on other people's sovereignty on occasion, and yet there is a general recognition, at least among children of the Enlightenment, if you would, that granting this autonomy, permitting it, is desirable. So how would you say that would relate to another super intelligent entity that we might encounter in the future, either of our own creation or, let's say, humans expand throughout the galaxy, start making contact with other sentient life forms?
Right. Well, I do agree that that's a good general rule, but it's certainly not absolute, and I think that all bets are off when they're sufficiently more intelligent to us than we are with regards to them.
So I suppose one other comment I'll make on this issue, you made a comparison between a human being and a mosquito, but it seems to me another comparison should be made between human beings and the higher animals, for whom most humans have considerably more compassion than they have for mosquitoes, particularly the most cognitively developed animals, say chimpanzees, dolphins, horses, elephants, dogs, cats. Most people would recoil at the thought of killing one of those. And that too is not an attitude that has been prevalent for all of human history. It's a fairly recent phenomenon, and it has especially been pronounced in the past few decades. But it seems to me another example of how increasing preponderance in human intelligence and prosperity has resulted in a better regard for these non-human creatures who are more proximate to us. So, and I think that does bode well for your parity argument, that is, a superintelligent AI who is closer to the human level of intelligence at that time is going to be able to make that connection a bit more. But of course, with an entity that is so much more intelligent than we are, there are aspects of its thinking that we can simply not foresee.
Yeah, that's true. I agree with that in large part. I think that the degree of morality that a given intelligence has to another intelligence is based on how similar to them they are. If we can picture those beings as approximately like us, then that bodes well for how ethically we treat them. Mm-hmm. So if there's a small gap between humans and AI, then I think that that bodes well for how it regards us and the ethicality of its decisions and its actions towards us. But as that intelligence increases, I think that it's more and more likely that it won't be able to approximate us to it. For instance, if a human were to consider the life of a bacterium, we understand it. We understand its actions completely, but we're very much removed from its motivations and how it subjectively feels to be a bacterium. So just because an AI is smarter and could hypothetically um, understand us um, exhaustively, um, even though it could understand us exhaustively, it could be so far removed from us that subjectively it can't approximate how it feels to be one of us. And once they get that far beyond, I think that it's dangerous water.
Well, it's definitely an interesting set of considerations to think about. The thought that comes to mind for me is, has perhaps a certain qualitative threshold been exceeded since the emergence of human beings, given that we do have this kind of discursive rationality that even any of the other higher animals lack. And so when we look at higher and higher stages of intelligence, those intelligent entities might think, those humans, even if they are considerably simpler, there might still be something to them. Whereas we can study a bacterium, we know what it does to pursue food, to reproduce, etc. But we might consider those functions to be so basic that we don't think very much of them, just because we don't see the same kind of individuality, the same kind of individual value and dignity that we would see in the functions of other humans or of certain higher animals who exhibit, say, an individual personality or exhibit certain kinds of learning or certain kinds of attachment and affection. But one other area I wanted to touch on with you is another possible set of obstacles to technological progress. Essentially, our discussion thus far has almost been along the lines of, what if a particular area of technology progresses too quickly, if there can be such a thing? But what has worried me in recent years is, what if the progress is not quick enough? What if, not because of technical factors, but because of societal and cultural and, to some extent, economic factors, certain technologies might not take off the ground or achieve mass adoption or mass acceptance, not because they're infeasible, but because the culture has in some way become rigid, ossified, resistant to those technologies. How much of a threat would you consider that to be, given the events of the past several years and how you might project them into the next several decades?
I would consider that to be the foremost obstacle towards the development, adoption, and acceptance of emerging technologies. I am certainly more concerned about humanity's outlook towards these technologies than whether or not they're actually feasible, because that's essentially the main and core driver of the development of these technologies, is our outlook and how we perceive the feasibility, the efficacy, and the desirability of these technologies. That, I think, is what's setting the pace for how soon these emerging technologies will be developed, whether they will be developed. So yes, I would consider that the foremost obstacle is our own mindsets and our own outlooks. We as a society hold all the cards in terms of how fast these technologies are developed, if they're developed.
Absolutely. And actually, one very simple but I think quite illustrative example of that is how much funding right now is being directed toward killing people, that is toward creating weapons of aggression that are routinely deployed, as compared to how much funding is devoted toward extending human lives, which is hidden
Absolutely.
to
And
military budgets.
yeah,
Uh,
precisely. And that demonstrates the point perfectly, that we're spending such ridiculous amounts of money essentially developing technological infrastructure for killing people, um, when we could be devoting so much more to both the development of certain emerging technologies and to studying the philosophical and in particular ethical and socioeconomic implications of these technologies. We could be spending so much more.
Absolutely. So that leads me to my next question. With regard to societal obstacles to emerging technologies, how could many of those obstacles be overcome? And in particular, how could they be overcome in time for us to reap the benefits of many of these emerging technologies?
Right. Well, again, it comes down to our own outlooks. I think that the best way to prevent these obstacles is to try and change the outlook that society has towards these emerging technologies, both both towards the emerging technologies themselves as well as to studying the many implications of emerging technologies.
Mhm.
So,
Now, yes.
so I think the best way to overcome those obstacles is to think and discuss and write about emerging technologies, to advocate for a more central position um, towards the study of these technologies.
Yes, and I recall in several writings of yours as well as a presentation, you made the point that right now, for instance, in the pursuit of indefinite life extension, there is more of a need for activism than there is for an additional researcher to join the field, because there are already many talented and qualified researchers who have avenues they would like to explore, but they are faced with some resource shortages. They sometimes do not have enough funding to realize all of their planned projects. And that's because a lot of the general public is either not aware of the potential for that research within our lifetimes, or harbor these old rationalizations for death and these misconceptions about what indefinite lifespans would entail. And I think it is fitting to delve into the topic of indefinite life extension. And I know you have pondered it at length. What are your thoughts about the pathway by which it could most readily be achieved, especially within our lifetimes? Do you think a more predominantly biomedical approach is most feasible, or more of a kind of gradual mind uploading approach, which you've explored in a lot of your writings, but it would need to be a gradual mind uploading approach that preserves what you've termed subjective continuity, so that it is still the same person experiencing life before and after the transition?
Right. Well, I consider the biomedical approach and the gradual mind uploading approach to be both feasible. However, I would say that, especially in terms of our own lifetime, I think that the biomedical route um, is most likely to achieve fruition and bear fruit in our lifetimes. I also think that, like you said earlier, in a lot of my articles, I argue that the largest bottleneck to achieving progress in indefinite life extension is the opinions and outlooks of society at large, because that's largely what controls the purse strings in funding. Um, and and in that respect, I think that the biomedical route has has the advantage of being seen as more feasible and feasible within a shorter time span to the general public. Also, the philosophical implications of biomedical life extension um, have certain areas that aren't as philosophically hairy as gradual mind uploading. So I think that adds to reasons why the biomedical route would be both more readily feasible given our current technical and technological infrastructure, and more appealing to the general public as a means of life extension.
Yes, absolutely. I do completely agree with you in your assessment, and I think with the biomedical route, a lot of arguments could be made that it's actually an eminently conservative route because you're trying to conserve what already exists, your life, your body, your vitality as it currently is. And actually, one of the mindsets of traditional conservatives that has always perplexed me was the ready acceptance of death and the so-called cycle of life as being, quote, normal or natural, when I'm thinking everything that these people are trying to preserve, everything these people value and want to keep the same, or at least keep essential aspects of the same, would be gone because of human mortality. The fact that nobody right now is alive who was alive in the year 1880 means a lot of knowledge, a lot of culture has been lost, and these commodities can never be replaced. So it does seem to me that the biomedical approach is more palatable and can be more readily framed in terms that a lot of people would accept. Now, this is still the challenge, though. Mass public acceptance of dramatically prolonging human lifespans at a similar rate at which, say, open heart surgery is accepted today, or attempting to cure cancer is accepted today. I think most people, apart from very fundamentalist religious zealots, would say those are desirable goals. So what do you foresee to be the future of public acceptance of dramatic extensions of human lifespans, and what developments do you think could be the most effective in bringing about that acceptance?
Well, I think that in general, society will become more accepting of the possibility of prolonged lifespans. And I think that the best way to achieve that is to attempt to increase awareness of the possibility and to advocate reasonably for the efficacy and desirability of prolonged lifespans. As I said before, and as you mentioned, I've argued that the foremost bottleneck to increasing funding in life extension is people's opinions and positions on the matter, because that's what controls the funding. More funding means that it will be achieved faster, and so I think the best route forward is to increase awareness of the feasibility and to advocate for its desirability and efficacy.
Yes, I think awareness of the feasibility is a major major goal to strive toward. It seems to me the moment you have a 60-year-old who looks like a 30-year-old, a lot of people are going to notice, and their attitudes are going to change. And a lot of people who might have been skeptical before, not because they had any deep moral aversion to life extension, but because they thought, oh, this is just a fantasy, it'll never happen in time for me, they might think, wait a minute, somebody has achieved this, I want it too. And that would set in motion the whole market dynamic that enables many emerging technologies to proliferate. One of my other major thoughts on this subject has been that the age at which a person is exposed to these ideas matters, especially today when biological age and chronological age are still very tightly intertwined. And a lot of people, as children, when they learn about death, their initial response is one of horror and outrage and aversion, but that very quickly gets quashed in them as their elders tell them, oh, don't worry about this because there's an afterlife in which you will persist, or if there isn't an afterlife, then it's still all normal and natural and part of the cycle of life, and you'd be selfish for rejecting that fate. And a lot of kids, unfortunately, don't find the resources to overcome that thinking unless they're particularly willful, as I was as a child, and hopefully as you were as a child too. But
True.
Indeed. So my illustrated children's book, Death is Wrong, tries to break through to that demographic and give children an alternative to a lot of the old rationalizations for death that they've been told. So do you think approaches like that could result in a subsequent generation being a lot more receptive to the prospect of radical life extension than their parents' or grandparents' generations had been?
I absolutely do. That book is wonderful, and it's one of the best things that you've done. And I also think that it's one of the most effective of moving this movement forward in deep time, because the beliefs and opinions that we form as children form so much of the bedrock of continuing sequent beliefs and positions on things, and it's so hard to rewrite those beliefs and positions that have already been crystallized in childhood. So I think that's one of the best routes to moving this thing forward in deep time, for certain.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much, Franco, for those good words. And I think we've talked quite a bit about overcoming public resistance or skepticism of emerging technologies. One other area I wanted to delve into with you, which was the subject of my discussion with Peter Rothman last week, is on the subject of virtual worlds, because that has been an area of emerging technology that has been rapidly advancing. And Peter Rothman was showing all of these old virtual reality headsets from the 1990s and discussing the challenges that early virtual reality experiences brought with them, challenges that in large part are being overcome today. And also he was discussing public acceptance of these technologies, which is much greater now than it had been in the 1990s, because people have become acclimated to computers, to the internet, to computer games and video games, and that makes a kind of fully immersive virtual experience just seem like the next incremental step. So I wanted to ask you the same question that I asked Peter, which is, how can virtual worlds help to improve the physical world?
Well, in general, the most obvious way is transcending the boundaries of space. The world is a large place, but it's becoming ever smaller. McLuhan's global village is crystallizing more and more. But in the farther future, I believe that virtual worlds and virtual reality in general will come to constitute a large part of the technological infrastructure we use to implement post-scarcity economies. There's a distinction to be made between virtual reality as it is now, with headsets, with augmented reality goggles, things like that, and its final form, which would be directly modulating the activity of neurons in physical brains. So, for instance, activating a certain sequence of neurons in your visual cortex in order to paint a picture in your mind. Once virtual reality is implemented via neurotechnology in that fashion, I think that it could come to constitute a large part of the infrastructure we use to create goods and services. In general, um, all those goods and services that we interact with largely on a perceptual basis. So, for instance, a lot of body modifications in the future, I think, will be, instead of actually being done to the body, we will have it such that others see those body modifications actually there. So other than things like food and medicine and physical infrastructure for housing and transportation and stuff like that, I think that for large part, neurotechnology mediated virtual reality will come to constitute a large part of what we see and hear. For instance, instead of investing money in like architectural features, we could have it such that brain-computer interfaces make us see that architecture in certain ways, and so we wouldn't actually have to build it in real life.
So it's definitely an interesting area of thought, and to a certain extent, this kind of virtual experience does exist today. Say you can play a game like Minecraft, and you can construct something in Minecraft that you could appreciate architecturally, even though there's no material parallel, no tangible parallel. It's still material in the sense that the underlying infrastructure on which it is built, that of the computer, is physical. But wouldn't there be a certain degree of caution that one would need to take with that kind of neuromodification? Because right now, the way human senses have evolved is to be directly responsive to the external reality, for better or for worse. If we're hurt, we feel pain, and that pain is a signal that something is wrong, something is dangerous, we should avoid taking that action again. And actually, people who have a condition where their pain receptors are disabled, they don't feel pain at all, they're actually a lot more likely to injure themselves because their degree of awareness of the external world and responsiveness to the external world is impaired. So it is an interesting question for me, because on the other hand, there are certain augmentations, modifications to our experience that we engage in right now that don't seem to be particularly harmful, like, say, running with a set of headphones and listening to music at the same time. While you're not receiving many of the sounds from your external environment, you're receiving sounds that you would rather prefer to hear, and that seems to be working fine as long as you have all your other senses functioning. But where does one draw that line, or at least some sort of fuzzy boundary between, let's say, augmenting or substituting for the experience of the external reality in a safe way, and one that would be, let's say, such a wholesale substitution that you actually lose valuable signals that are needed to keep you alive and keep you safe?
Right. Well, I think that the safest route is the middle ground. For instance, it would be relatively safe to walk down the street and to see buildings and surfaces differently, so long as those different surfaces actually correspond physically with the real world. But if you were walking, if you didn't actually see roadways as roadways, and vice versa, then yeah, that can be really tricky. So I think that the safest route is to have a middle ground, more of an augmented reality situation rather than a fully alternate immersive virtual world situation.
Yes, and this was actually an area of discussion I had touched on with Peter Rothman as well. He described a concept called mixed reality, which it seems is more than just what is commonly understood as augmented reality. It's more of the presence of these virtual elements in one's everyday experience. And to him, for instance, Microsoft's HoloLens is a very good example of that, because now, instead of just, say, getting data in real time about some activity you're engaging in, as I, for instance, get via this Fitbit device, you can actually see virtual objects on a physical desktop. And that's just one of the applications of a HoloLens. So, yes, it seems to me that that route would be the most prudent route to take, because you could think of a lot of beneficial augmentations, but in that case, the role for abstract reasoning becomes even more crucial, because now you have to use your judgment not just in terms of how you respond to external perceptual stimuli, but how you choose to structure those perceptual stimuli. What do you choose to put in your virtual environment to still enable you to operate effectively given the constraints of objective natural laws that aren't going away. So definitely a very interesting set of areas to think about. I also liked your comments about the alleviation of scarcity and essentially lifting the constraints of space. We're doing that right now via our conversation, even though we're roughly on opposite ends of the North American continent. And a lot of people have been engaging in that already. One of my thoughts was this could really revolutionize the business world once fully immersive virtual conferencing environments could be created, because one of the big reasons why telecommuting or working remotely has not taken off as much as we enthusiasts of digital technologies would have wanted it to take off is because a lot of people have this mindset that you need face-to-face interaction, you need real-time interaction for the most effective results. So what if you could have a reasonable facsimile of that, and not even just, say, in a Skype or Google Hangout type of setting, but in a fully immersive setting where it feels like you're in the same room with these people for the hour or two that you need to have that discussion, and then you each go your own ways to do whatever work you agreed to do, and you come back and confer again, and if you need to ask a question, you can actually get in contact with that person in another virtual environment. So what do you think of that possibility, and how proximate it would be to our time?
Well, how proximate it is to our time is a tougher question. But I do think that once it reaches a certain degree of similarity, it just becomes the obvious better choice, and that alleviates a lot of things. It frees up time. It frees up resources that would have been used traveling to and from your workplace. So yeah.
Yes, absolutely. And of course, the travel aspect is a huge one in terms of improving the physical world. The more people telecommute, the fewer people contribute to roadway congestion, the fewer people are exposed to the risk of injury and death from an automobile accident. And of course, here's an application of artificial intelligence that I think is tremendously promising if the general culture can accept it: autonomous vehicles, which could save all those lives that are lost each year due to human error on the roads. But virtuality is also another contributing factor that could be very powerful here. because we'll have fewer people driving, and the ones that are on the roads will be in autonomous vehicles that are a lot less prone to get into those accidents. So definitely a lot of promise in this regard. Now, Franco, I'm curious as to your thoughts about this, because you've been alive long enough to think back, say, 10 years, and what your expectations of the future were like at that point, and you might have had some reasonable prognostications of what the next 10 years would hold. And I'm curious, how has the reality compared to your expectations, your foresight at the time, or at any more recent time? Do you believe the pace of progress over the past few years especially has been sufficiently rapid to give us grounds for hope, or do you think it's been a disappointment in certain respects?
Well, I think that the pace of progress has not quite matched my expectations, although the pace of progress in terms of how easy it is for people to believe in the feasibility of these technologies, I think that I've seen pretty rapid progress in that regard, which is at end of day more promising than actual physical progress in the development of these technologies, because it's our outlook and society's position on the feasibility of these technologies that's the real driver of the physical real progress in these technologies. So I've definitely seen, I think, progress in that respect, in the respect of people's positions and people's capacity to consider these things feasible. And I think that that's more promising than if the physical real development of these technologies had matched my expectations better.
Yes, I'm inclined to agree with you. There has been attitudinal progress, and going about one's day-to-day life, one might sometimes overlook it. But I've had a few people tell me, say with regard to Death is Wrong, that had I published that book a few years earlier, it probably would not have achieved the same kind of exposure and publicity that it achieved in early 2014. And that's saying something. Zoltan Istvan has been tremendously prolific over the past several years, ever since the Transhumanist Wager came out, and the reception for his articles is tremendous. And he has also written about the rapid and accelerating growth of the transhumanist movement, which a decade and a half ago was essentially a few hundred people, and now active transhumanists would number somewhere in the tens of thousands. We've had the movement for indefinite life extension for several years, and every year its goal has been to achieve an order of magnitude more supporters, and that has to date been
that's a very formidable goal, and one that it's kept on achieving year after year, which is very huge in my opinion.
Yes, indeed. We're actually going to host the Mile demonstration via Google Hangout on March 21st, and longevity activists worldwide are going to be participating in it, filming themselves, holding up physical signs that Mile is making available to them. So it is quite an exciting event, and hopefully that will further raise awareness. As I've told you, I'm very much on the same page with you with regard to activist initiatives and finding interesting ways to prominently highlight the cause of indefinite life extension and other emerging technologies as well, because I think they do work in tandem with one another, and if they can progress in parallel, you can solve many problems simultaneously, so that the fears of a lot of the skeptics, like, oh, if people stop dying, then there will be rapid overpopulation, can be assuaged by saying, wait a minute, other solutions to current problems are going to be devised at the same time. And so there is definitely a prospect that what we might consider to be an intractable difficulty today, which I don't consider overpopulation to be at all, by the way, but anything else could still be resolved in the future if we can push forward technological progress a bit more. So my own thinking on this, and tell me if you agree, is when you look at the experience of life on the surface, apart from the electronic technologies, which really have dramatically changed even over the past 10 years, much of life still appears to be structurally similar to what it was like, say, in the mid-1970s. But when you look at more of the underlying trends, changes in the prevalence of certain attitudes or behaviors or understandings or outcomes, you could actually detect a dramatic shift. About a month ago, I was looking at mortality statistics for cardiovascular disease since the 1970s. And I was looking at mortality rates, how many people out of each 100,000 of the population of a particular age will die of cardiovascular disease. And what was amazing to me is those mortality rates at pretty much every age declined by about fourfold since the 1970s. Now that doesn't mean people are living vast amounts of time longer, because if they survive cardiovascular disease, something else might kill them in a few years anyway, which is why it's imperative to take an integrated approach to combating the ravages of senescence. But it seems to me, to make a more general observation, the superficial signs of progress are less promising than some of the underlying trends. Would you agree with that characterization?
Yeah, I would agree with that very much.
Mm-hmm.
Which harkens back to the earlier point that progress in attitudes, attitudinal progress, can go farther than progress, for lack of a better term, physical progress, progress in the actual development of certain technologies.
Now here's a challenging question, and it's a challenging question because I really can't claim to know the answer either. A lot of transhumanists talk about existential risk, and they try to think of existential risks that might emerge in the future with regard to technologies that aren't at that stage yet. It seems to me, though, a vast amount of existential risk actually arises from the status quo, and not just from natural disasters, but from man-made disasters. Humankind was on the brink of a nuclear apocalypse for 3.5 decades until the end of the Cold War. And now it seems that some people, especially the neoconservative hawks in the United States, have some sort of nostalgia for that era and seek to rekindle it via the crisis in Ukraine. And then you have, of course, just rampant human barbarism in some parts of the world. See the wanton destruction of ISIS in Iraq. ISIS seems to me to just be the most absolutely villainous organization imaginable. Every atrocity against human beings, every atrocity against historic cultural achievement. So on the one hand, you have in the civilized world a lot of people who are interested in technological progress, a lot of people who are trying to further it. Some people are on the fence, some people aren't sure, some people are cautious or skeptical, but I wouldn't really consider them to be threats in the same way. They may need to be nudged and persuaded. But then you have in some parts of the world, and I wouldn't limit it to any particular group of people, but this general, I would say, atavistic savagery that has been with humankind ever since its existence. But the, let's say, drive to commit barbaric acts or the pressure to escalate a military situation into a potentially deadly worldwide conflict. How can humankind overcome that so that that becomes just a relic of history instead of something that's present with us?
Well, I would say that emerging technologies is at once the greatest creator of new existential threats and the greatest solution to existing existential threats. Um, and yeah, I would say that our greatest that our best route forward to combating current existential threats is to develop emerging technologies and to develop them conscientiously with deliberative foresight into the possible implications to existing existential threats and to new possible existential threats that are created from the emerging technologies themselves. Are you still there, Kennedy? Gennady, can you hear me? Gennady, your video and audio is cut out on my end. Can you still hear me?